Thank you all so much. And Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much for framing the conversation that we're about to have on the security challenges facing Europe, which wasn't necessarily the exclusive topic of your talk, but certainly was integrally related. Thank you to the World Affairs Council. I'm John Harris. I'm the editor-in-chief of Politico. I agreed today to waive my usual speaking fee. I would have insisted on a World Affairs Council coffee cup to take with me. But in lieu of that, if you could give me a little bit of a commercial plug, my primary assignment at Politico these days is to plant our flag in Europe, specifically with a new publication based in Brussels, but also with reporters in capitals of London, Berlin, Paris, and more to come. It's politico.eu. To supplement Politico.com. When we did this, Mr. Ambassador, I don't mean to hurt your feelings, but people said, I guess it's interesting, but isn't Europe kind of boring? And isn't Brussels really boring? And we didn't think it's boring, and we don't. In the 6 months that we have been there, we have covered, our team of 40 reporters and editors over there has covered Greek financial crisis, I guess about 3 of them actually in the last 6 months, and more to come. We've covered, there's a big ongoing debate, lively this week, over Brexit and whether the future of Great Britain's role in the European Union. We've got this terrible migration crisis, and even just in the routine nature of business, the competition commissioner in Europe has taken on several of the world's largest companies, including major U.S. companies like Google. If we can't find a way to make that interesting, we're in the wrong line of work as journalists. And I think, as your talk said, Europe is simply not boring. It's fascinating. It's more relevant to the policy discussion here than ever before. So commercial plug over, but I do hope you come maybe get in the habit of going to politico.eu. We've got strict orders here to finish up by 11:30. I thought people are free to make opening statements of however much they want, but I'd encourage you all to follow up on Ambassador O'Sullivan's remarks. And I would say, as moderator, one of the questions a couple of the questions that I hope we illuminate by the end of the morning here. When we talk about European security, what do we mean? We're used to thinking of security in the context of tanks coming over from the east with a leader like Vladimir Putin in Russia. That prospect, maybe not tanks coming over from the east, but we're again thinking of security in more conventional terms. But also, as Ambassador O'Sullivan has really highlighted, there's lots of ways to destabilize a society. Financial crises can do it. Migration crises can do it. Terrorism, as much of a threat in Europe as it has been in the United States. So how do we define European security would be one big question I hope we can shine a light on in the course of this morning. And the other question I would have is, what is the primary vehicle for protecting, preserving, promoting European security? Is it still NATO? At the end of the day, security must be defined in military terms. Is it the European Union, which is the primary vehicle for economic crises and the migration crises? Or maybe is Europe kind of and there's plenty of people that think Europe is kind of a fiction. There is no Europe in a political sense. There's individual countries with individual leaders, individual national interests, and the interplay between capitals and between national interests is still fundamentally where the most important debates get resolved, rather than in an institutional setting. So anyway, that's what I'm curious about. I'll let you guys pull on whatever thread you like. You have the bios of all our panelists in your book, so we don't need to repeat those. We've got the president of the Ukrainian World Congress here, and you've got to help me with your name. I know I'm not going to. Eugene is no problem for me.
Czolij.
Czolij, okay. The president of the Ukrainian World Congress, and I'd love you to start, and then we'll come right down the row.
I'd like to start by saying that from my perspective, the biggest biggest security challenge for the West is how to deal with a corrupt, authoritarian, lawless Russian president that defies the international community, violates just about every agreement that he signs or that has been signed by his predecessors. And today uses his imperialist ambitions in a manner that destabilizes Europe and the world order as we know it. We very often dismiss what President Putin has clearly set out as his agenda. President Putin in 2005 has said that the breakup of the Soviet Union is the biggest catastrophe of the 20th century, and he has set out to reconstruct a new Russian empire. And for President Putin and for us in the West, Mr. Brzezinski has said several times that without Ukraine, Russia can never again be that dangerous empire that it was in the 20th century. That's why President Putin has started with a Eurasian perspective, where he thought that he could get Ukraine to sign the customs union and eventually bring it within his concept of a Eurasian union with a common political, economic, customs, military space that Hillary Clinton has properly described as a revamped Soviet Union. And he has almost succeeded, because in 2000, just prior to the Euromaidan, he has signed several clandestine agreements with President Yanukovych that would have eventually led to this kind of reconstruction. We all know that the Euromaidan has put an end to those plans, and President Putin, being who he is, resorted to military. February 2014, Crimea. April, Russia-backed terrorists in eastern Ukraine, and then regular army in August of 2014. And when he sent that army, that was simply because he knew the international community would not really do anything serious to counteract such military activity. He has tested the international community in 2008 in Georgia and has seen that what we do very well. We condemned the events in 2008 in Georgia, and then it was business as usual with Russia. His military activity in Crimea and in eastern Ukraine has led to 8,000 people dying, 18,000 wounded, and now over 1.4 million internally displaced persons. And for all of those who think that this is strictly a Ukrainian-Russian crisis, during that period of time, there was the downing of the MH17 with 300 people, about 300 people dying from 10 countries in the world. From my perspective...
We've got plenty to chew on there, so I want to...
Let me just finish with a concluding thought. From my perspective, if the international community does not react immediately, strongly, I'm talking about sanctions, strong sanctions that are not limited in a time barred, but sanctions that actually spell out that unless Russia complies with its international obligations, the sanctions will become harsher. Unless we threaten Russia of getting them off the SWIFT banking system, and unless we provide military assistance to stop Russia at the Ukrainian border, the Russian president will be emboldened to test the international community by testing Section 5 or Paragraph 5 of the NATO treaty, and we will then have to sacrifice either another country or experience the Third World War.
Thank you. We've got a lot to chew on there, and we're going to return to that. But I'm wondering if any of our panelists free to have opening statements, but if anybody wants to respond to that as part of their opening statement, why don't we take it away? And by the way, we want to enlist this entire room in the conversation as much as possible. So does somebody, Secretary Rose, why don't you go ahead and please do it, and we'll also go to Ambassador Simonyi? Simonyi, okay.
Say it right.
Simonyi, you guys have got a couple of difficult names
well,
up here.
John,
why don't you do that? But we're going to return to that topic soon.
Yeah, something tells me we'll be talking about Russia quite a bit this morning.
I hope so.
Well, John, thanks so much for having me here today. Thank you very much, Mr. Czolij and Ambassador Simonyi. Among the many accolades you've heard about the ambassador, one of the things that you probably don't know, that he has been on the Colbert Report on numerous occasions. And I can only hope to reach that part in my career. Well, let's just say I'm very glad to have a chance to talk to you
I was
today.
invited once, by the way, and then got canceled. So that's sort of humiliating.
You canceled?
They revoked the invite.
I'm very glad to have the chance to talk to you today about the security challenges caused by Russia's action and rhetoric that have contributed to greater insecurity and concern on the European continent. Over the past 2 decades, the United States built a partnership with Russia through dialogue and practical cooperation in areas of common interest, especially with regards to arms control and strategic stability. The good news is that cooperation on strategic arms control with the Russian Federation endures despite a downturn in relations due to Russia's actions in Crimea and in eastern Ukraine. The same cannot be said for many of the other arms control instruments that shape the post-Cold War landscape and remain fundamental to mutual security in the Euro-Atlantic area. When the United States and Russia signed the New START Treaty in 2010, bilateral relations were improving and expectations were that a fruitful partnership on further steps was in the making. Russia's illegal actions in Crimea and inconsistent implementation of its arms control obligations have triggered just the opposite. In light of this downturn in relations, the predictability and stability that the New START Treaty provides have proven all the more important. Without this tool, we would not have access to or limits on Russia's strategic nuclear forces. Since the treaty's entry into force in 2011, the United States and Russia have each conducted its annual allocation of 18 on-site inspections and exchanged over 9,600 notifications related to the deployment status, location, and movement of strategic nuclear forces. The verification regime of the New START Treaty provides confidence to both sides that they will be able to determine whether the others have met the treaty's central limits when they take effect in 2018. We hold no illusions that we can do more, which is why President Obama proposed an up to 1/3 reduction below the New START level of deployed strategic nuclear forces, an offer that Russia, surprise, has yet to embrace. While implementation of the New START Treaty marches forward, the picture is less rosy with respect to the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, or INF Treaty. The United States takes its treaty obligations seriously and expects others to do the same. My bureau at the State Department publishes the annual Arms Control Compliance Report. We first announced in the 2014 edition and reiterated in this year's edition our determination of Russia's violation of the INF Treaty. Russia's violation is not a technicality or an issue of mistaken identity. This is a serious violation of one of the core tenets of the INF Treaty, not to produce or flight test intermediate range launch cruise missiles. Let me be clear, we do not seek to demonize Russia, but Russia must abide by its legal obligations to us and others. And while we do not seek to return to the escalatory cycle of action-reaction that marked much of the Cold War, we are committed that Russia needs to return to compliance. If it does not, we will take whatever steps are needed to ensure our security and the security of our allies. We are pursuing various ways to motivate Russia to return to compliance with the INF Treaty, including possible economic and military responses should Russia persist in its violation and continue to reject our efforts to resolve the issue diplomatically. We will ensure that Russia does not gain any advantage over the United States or its allies through its pursuit of such systems. We will also forcefully and factually refute Russia's groundless and diversionary claims that the United States is seeking to undermine the INF Treaty. Far from it, we are fully and faithfully complying with the INF Treaty. At every turn, we have offered to engage Russia on their concerns if they engage us on ours. And in response, we have received nothing but denials. At the signing of the INF Treaty with General Secretary Gorbachev in 1987, President Reagan expressed hope that an arms control agreement backed by a strict verification regime would serve as a template for other treaties on conventional and nuclear weapons. Indeed, INF served as the forerunner to future regimes that were staples of the U.S. and regional security for decades before falling victim to a new way of operating in Russia, one that selectively implements its arms control obligations. In addition to the challenges we face with INF, the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty is under stress, the Open Skies Treaty is under stress, as well as the Vienna document, which calls for and allows inspections of military capabilities on the continent. One of my major concerns, what we are seeing, is that Russia no longer believes that the post-Cold War arms control and European security framework put in place at the end of the 1980s and early 1990s is in its interest. And I think this is going to be a challenge as we move forward. So let me stop there, John.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Secretary Rose. Is your opening statement on Russia or more broad?
I'd like to say a little bit about Russia.
Could you, as you do so?
As was expected.
Because
What could you expect from
John, it will
would-
not be boring, huh?
I would love if in the course of this you shed some light on me, because you guys are in agreement about Russia being a problem. Secretary Rose says it's a source of instability and concern, but we don't seek to demonize Russia. On the other hand, you, Mr. President, say that we're conceivably have to think about the possibility of a third world war because of, and you don't refer to Russia, you refer specifically to Putin and as a corrupt force. And it seems to me we've got a lot to work with there because that's a very relevant debate. There are some people who see what's going on, the tensions with Russia, as an expression of traditional Russian nationalism and its desire to play a powerful role in the world, even at the expense of kicking up dust. And there are some people who regard Putin as almost like that little boy in The Omen. Did you guys watch that? Damien. Troublesome boy actually is Satan. In other words, he's not an autocrat. He's a messianic and metastasizing figure. And it seems to me that there are big implications in the difference between those two interpretations of what Russia is up to.
Well, first, before I do this, Politico is bringing an article we have co-written with a friend of mine, Mike Holzer, who's a long-time assistant to Joe Biden.
Thank you.
It's entitled, Why the United States Needs to Double... It's not turned on? How do you turn this on? Even a Hungarian can't handle this. Do you see anything? We see the red light, not the green light.
Help is on the way.
Can you hear me? You know what? Why don't I speak into? Can you hear me now?
That works.
Okay, so Politico is bringing this article, why America needs to double down on Europe. So read that, and then you will get all our thoughts about why there is no alternative to the transatlantic relationship. So that's the broader context. I'll stop here. But I look down the audience, and I can see that if I bring some rock and roll metaphor, you will at least half of you guys will understand what I'm talking about. Let me say that David Sullivan is really, I was going to say he's the Mick Jagger of European foreign policy, but I can't say that. I can't say that because he's Irish, so I'd say he's the Bono of the. And by the way, continuing with the rock and roll metaphor, I would like to commend Politico because I really think you guys are the Rolling Stone magazine of European journalism.
Another advertisement.
So I really like that, and I have you on my app, and I don't have too many apps on my phone. And then finally, Mr. Secretary, thank you for mentioning the Colbert Report, but more importantly, your predecessor, three times removed Lincoln Bloomfield, is the bass player in my band called the Coalition of the Willing. So let me stop here. I was just trying to establish my credentials, but let me say a few words about Russia. We are really worried for all kinds of reasons, and some of the reasons have not been mentioned here. And there are three things I want to talk about very briefly. One is the danger of backsliding of democracies in Europe. This is a serious danger, especially in Central and Eastern Europe. And I'm glad someone mentioned the present Hungarian Prime Minister. I used to work for him, but I'm not a fan. And he's a fan of Vladimir Putin. And I just want to say that one of the real dangers, Russia is a disruptive power. Its ambition is first and foremost to destabilize Europe, to draw the wedge between Europe and the United States. That's his primary goal, because strong democracies, resilient democracies, are seen as a threat to his power. And that's really the essence of why he's doing what he's doing. He wants to stay in power forever. This is one. Two, energy. Energy security is the tool in the hands of Vladimir Putin. I'm glad that the European Union is now seriously working on what they call the energy union. But I think also Americans need to work a little more diligently to get U.S. LNG and U.S. shale oil to Europe, to make sure that we are not, some countries are at this moment 90% dependent on Russian energy. And you know, Russia is a source not just of energy but of corruption. With oil and gas from Russia comes corruption. And I just want to, as a side note, I want to mention, I'm very disappointed. I will be very disappointed if I don't know if you've heard of Nord Stream 2. This is the gas pipeline that will circumvent Central Eastern Europe and Ukraine. I think it's a bad idea, and I think it's a disaster. And finally, let me make a comment on the refugee crisis, which is not unrelated. 2 months ago, we wrote an article suggesting that don't be surprised if we one day find out that Vladimir Putin had something to do with the sudden emergence of this number of refugees on the European shores and European borders. And I think while Syria is a very complicated issue, don't underestimate the element where Vladimir Putin's calculation was, if I make the situation a little worse in Syria, it will be a lot worse in Europe. So it might help my goal just a little bit. Trust me, it's not far-fetched, and I'm being criticized all the time. You know, you're just a Hungarian, you don't like the Russians. And I keep telling people, just because I'm a Hungarian, I might still be right.
Thank you. Bono, it's your turn.
I'm sorry.
Yes. So you're the Hunter S. Thompson of the fear and loathing on the road to Brussels. Yes. I can agree with much of what has been said about Russia. I think Mr. Putin has torn up the rule book in Europe, and this changes dramatically the security equation. So I get that completely, and I think we are responding to it. It's complicated because, as the US administration is also finding out, we want to push back on what Mr. Putin is doing in Ukraine, and by the way, also in Moldova and Armenia and Georgia. And on the other hand, we still need to talk about issues of common concern. When we needed a deal in Iran, Russia had to be a part of that, and was. We're now trying to sort out Syria, and frankly, we need Russia at the table, as we need Iran at the table, as we need Saudi Arabia at the table. So I'm afraid international politics is a complicated business, and you have to be able to, I won't say compartmentalize, but you have to be able to sort of juggle conflicting objectives. I think we need to be very, very firm, and I don't disagree at all with what Andras says about Mr. Putin's attempts to destabilize some of the democracies in Europe. I believe we have to be able to resist that. But I also think, going back to your point, that the security threats facing Europe are actually multiple, and it's difficult to say it's only one. We live in a dangerous neighborhood, so Mr. Putin is a clear major source of concern on our eastern borders. But frankly, what is happening south of our borders is also of major concern. Geography is destiny, perhaps, but if you're Maltese or Greek or Italian, obviously you are much more concerned about the massive instability in North Africa than you are necessarily, also though you're worried about what's happening on the east. We have frankly, the migration crisis, but we also have climate change. We're soon going to see climate change. I'm willing to blame Mr. Putin for many things, almost anything, but I honestly think that the migration crisis, we know what happened. You've got 4 million people displaced outside Syria in UN-funded camps or UN-funded facilities, World Food Programme. They've run out of money. After 4 years there, people just decided to uproot and walk, because they knew what was coming. The World Food Programme, we're talking about having to eliminate the food which they were giving the refugees. So I mean, I think this is part of the complexity. We will have climate change migration, which we will certainly see from Africa. We have cyber terrorism. We have non-state actors such as ISIS and terrorism. These are all, all of these threats are going to have to be addressed. Unfortunately, it's not possible to reduce it to one. Even if one is extremely important, I agree, for the continued security on the European continent. To your question, what is the answer in Europe? Firstly, I think in pure security terms, yes, NATO remains absolutely at the core of our security strategy of most of our member states, and I can say that as an Irish person because we're not in NATO, we're neutral apparently. As one famous Irish Prime Minister said, we're neutral, we just haven't decided who we're neutral against. But NATO is for the vast bulk of European countries at the core of our security strategy, but frankly we will need a European dimension, and I don't think having a European defence dimension, having a European common foreign and security policy is inimical to working within NATO, and I think increasingly in Washington people would actually like to see the EU and Europeans doing more on defence. And we will also have individual countries. But the point I wanted to make is that it is the European institutions that ultimately are the glue that hold all this together. We would not have sanctions against Russia, if we did not have the European institutions driving the process which put those sanctions in place. We would not have had sanctions against Iran, and we would not have maintained them if it was not the European institutions which drove those forward and held them in place. So I think we will always be a mixture of the European and the national, but frankly it is, and believe me, you will see it tested in coming months, but it is the solidity of the institutions. It is ultimately the fact that people have to turn up in Brussels, meet with their fellow prime ministers around a table, and be answerable for what they're doing that actually provides a remarkable degree of discipline and cohesiveness, which is what held the euro together. It will hold us together on migration, and it will ultimately hold us together in facing these security challenges, including that of Russia.
Yes, sir.
I just want to add one thing. I was in Stockholm 2 days ago, and basically 2 questions were asked. One set of questions was whether it's Trump or Carson. The other question was, is the United States inclined to stay in Europe or leave Europe? And my answer to that, to the Swedes, is very clear. First of all, Sweden should join NATO. This is one. The second, it's counterintuitive. The more Europe spends it on its own defense, the more the United States will be inclined to stay and help Europeans. And that's something that I think we Europeans need to understand. I hear it more and more and more. And it's not just about the 2% spending, but it's also about the readiness and willingness to use our military capabilities in times of crisis, defending the Baltics, and I could go on and on.
Can I? Sorry.
Yeah, please.
Excuse me.
Let's go for it. Secretary Rosen, then back to you, Mr. Ambassador.
Great. John, one point I want to make is, sometimes it's really easy to demonize Putin because he's such a good bad guy. But as I tell my colleagues, sometimes you need to sit down, step back and sit down and think. Probably one of the best books that I have read on U.S.-Russian relations in the post-Cold War period is a book by Angela Stent. She's at Georgetown University. It's called The Limits of Partnership. And basically, she says the fundamental challenges in the relationship between the U.S. and Russia and the West and Russia go down to a couple of key points. First, we have very different interpretations of the 1990s. The 1990s for the United States and U.S.-Russia relations is a time of hope and opportunity. It is exactly the opposite in Russia. In Russia, the 1990s is viewed as a period of corruption, chaos, and humiliation. And you need to understand Putin in that context. He brought stability back. Secondly, and we're seeing this in Ukraine right now, the U.S. and Russia have fundamentally different interpretations on how the former Soviet space should be governed. For the United States and the European Union, we believe that countries should, one, be able to elect their own leaders and be able to freely associate with whomever they want. That is not the Russian view. The Russian view is that they have a special responsibility in the countries of the former Soviet Union, especially with regards to countries where there are large ethnic Russian populations. So if you want to read a good book about kind of where the tensions are coming from, I recommend Angela Stent's book. Now, one other point that I would make is you also need to look at Russia's overarching strategic situation. They are not in a particularly good place. First of all, Russia has no real allies. Well, they have Assad in the People's Republic of Donetsk, but not the most reliable allies. Secondly, they do not have a modern 21st century economy. Outside of oil and gas and weapons, what does Russia export? Not much. There was a wonderful article in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago about the new Russian smartphone. And basically what the article said is the new Russian smartphone is a joke. And the article was not just about the smartphone, but the fact that Russia has never been able to innovate its civilian economy and is not competitive. Its population is shrinking. They are losing several 100,000 people a year. There was actually a very interesting story on this on NPR yesterday morning. Their conventional capabilities, though they have improved, and we are seeing that in Syria, they are not on par with the United States or China, which leads me to my last point. Though they talk about their, quote, strategic partnership with China, they are very concerned long-term about China. China is a growing power. They have an economic model, even though it has challenges now. Compared to Russia, they are a power on the rise. Russia, long-term, has some very significant challenges. So I think it's really important for us to take a step back sometimes and look long-term, because I know sometimes when you deal with the Russians, it's like a Rocky and Bullwinkle commercial when you see Boris and Natasha. That's what, believe me, I see that all the time, but you have to take a step back.
If I've got this right, I think we've got two people that say really bad guy, but let's not overreact. And we've got one, and I think two, really bad guy, let's not underreact. Is that right? Let's hear from you.
I think that's right. I by the way agree, Angela Stent is one of the smartest people around. But I'd strongly recommend you also to read Bill Browder's book about the Magnitsky trial or the Magnitsky case on what Russia has become under Vladimir Putin, who is a bully, who understands only the language of the baseball bat. And I don't disagree with neither of you that we need to work with the Russians on some issues, but be careful. I have two photographs in my office. One photograph is the 1956 November 4 issue of the Baltimore Sun on the invasion by Russian troops of Hungary, crushing our revolution. The other picture is me standing with Yuri Gagarin. I was even as a 10-year-old, I was starstruck. So I am standing there with Yuri Gagarin, just to remind me the two faces of Russia, what Russia could have become if it was a normal country, how Google could have been established by Sergey Brin in Russia if Russia was a real country, and the other face of Russia that is just not going away. This aggressive attitude towards smaller nations, then an aggressive desire to dominate. And so I think it's just reality. And I caution to not give up the hope that Russia one day might change, but it's a very, very, very long way, far away. That's going to take a long, long time.
We want to incorporate the audience soon, but Eugene, I think we have to hear from you.
I'd just like to say that although I agree that what you've explained as different perspectives in looking at history in the 90s, the Western and the Russian interpretation of the events, I certainly hope that nobody today will agree with the fact that one must change the rules of the game. I think that if we are to live in a world for our children, for our grandchildren, that is safe, secure, and stable, everybody needs to abide by the same rules. We cannot allow Russia to be a country that is entitled by whatever reasoning one may try to find to justify it, to dictate its will on other democratic countries. And I think that if we go into that route, we will experience what we have already experienced prior to the Second World War, where we tried the theory of appeasement, and we obviously failed. Every time one uses appeasement against a person such as Vladimir Putin, one loses that game. So I agree with the ambassador that one must negotiate with Russia, one must live with Russia, but one must live and negotiate from a position of power and not from a position of weakness. That is the only way to survive.
A couple of our panelists have raised hands here. Ambassador Czolij, you said yes.
No, I just wanted to pick up on Andras's point, because where I agree clearly is that Putin's action has changed the security posture. And coming from a generation, and as I said in my introductory remarks, which thought that we were building peace in Europe, and frankly that we were dismantling the need to be ready for war because we weren't going to have any, I think unfortunately that has changed. But on the defense expenditure point, it's just very important to bear in mind that Europe collectively, the 28 member states, actually spends about 50% of what the US spends, but massively more than Russia and massively more than China. We actually have more men in uniform, or men and women in uniform, than the United States does, 1.5 million. The problem is that we don't get value for that. So I think the debate in Europe should less be about, with all due respect to the NATO 2% objective, about precise measurement of how much money you're spending, and much more about outputs and capacities. How many people can you put in the field? How much airlift capacity? How much air-to-air refueling capacity? And that's a debate which very much in terms of the European Union, where greater cooperation between our member states, we would actually get more value for the money we're spending, and we wouldn't necessarily have to persuade our people to spend more on defense when they're cutting education and social security budgets, but we could actually get better value for money, which would in turn send a message to anyone who thought that aggression could be further extended.
Secretary Rose, briefly, and then let's get some hands up. We've got 10 minutes or so, and we want to incorporate.
Yeah, no, I fully agree that we need to stand up when Russia makes illegal actions in Ukraine, in other places. No ifs, ands, or buts about that. But what I am the point I'm trying to make is this. There is a certain narrative that Putin and his coterie around him have sold to the Russian people, and that is this. Russia was humiliated in the late 80s and early 1990s, and all of these agreements were put in place when Russia was weak. Now we seek to overturn them because we are an equal. And I think we are seeing that across the board, whether it be the territorial settlement of 1991, whether it be the arms control treaties like CFE and the INF Treaty. And that's the challenge that we face going forward.
Let's go to questions. I've got to have a moderator's prerogative here. If you've got a comment, let's make it really brief. Even better, a question, and even better, a sharply defined question that can go to a specific panelist rather than a general one. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, sharp question. I've heard the option of military against Russia. Could you walk us through that? I know that was something that we would definitely want to avoid in dealing with Russia. Yeah, I just heard the option of military, coming up with regard to managing Russia. Can you tell us what that would look like?
Well, what I talked about was in the context of responding to the Russian violation of the INF Treaty. Specifically, if Russia were to persist and deploy this new ground-launched cruise missile, the United States is prepared to work with our friends and allies to deploy effective capabilities to deny them any bid effect. Do we want to go there? No. Do we want to use diplomacy to bring the Russians back into compliance? Yes. Have our diplomatic efforts to date been effective? I would say the answer is no. So again, we don't want to get into an action-reaction cycle with regards to intermediate nuclear forces in Russia, but at the same time, as President Obama said in his seminal arms control speech in Prague in 2009, words must mean something when it comes to arms control, and violations must be punished.
We're going to get to as many of these as possible. I think we'll go back there. Again, I'd prefer if you would direct it specifically to a panelist if you think it pertains most logically to one.
Thank you. Grayson Lanza, Naples Council on World Affairs. My question specifically to Ambassador Sullivan. It's about frozen conflicts. And there's a fear within the Baltic states and with Ukraine right now of the eventual frozen conflict status that we see throughout Europe already because of Russian minority issues. What is Europe doing in regards to that security threat to address these fears and maybe future events?
Well, I think we have frozen conflicts on our frontiers in a number of neighboring countries, Georgia, Armenia, and so forth. The fear and what we are desperately trying to avoid is that eastern Ukraine turns into a frozen conflict. I mean, I fear that Crimea is a de facto frozen conflict. I think the threat is very real, and I think that's the very strong message that has to go to Mr. Putin, that any attempt to replicate what has happened elsewhere within the NATO alliance or within the countries of the European Union would be a red line which would have serious consequences if crossed. And personally, I think he probably gets that, because I think while he has all the characteristics that have been attributed to him, I think he also is quite clever in calculating what he can and cannot do. But I think that is a risk, and I understand the concerns of the Baltic states. By the way, other countries in the neighborhood, Kazakhstan and others, have also got similar worries about what it means to be able to act on behalf of Russian-speaking minorities outside the Russian territory. So this is a very serious dimension to the threat, and one to which we need to be very alert indeed.
Go to this side of the room. I think we've got one right over there. The gentleman with the, yes, sir, you.
Yes, in the mid-'90s, I was in Europe, and I saw protests in front of the U.S. embassies demanding we intervene in Yugoslavia. And President Obama recently did a pivot towards Asia. You guys couldn't handle Yugoslavia. You couldn't handle Libya. You say you're making these expenditures. When are you going to step up? We can't do it all for you. Why shouldn't we turn to Asia?
Who do you most want to be the piñata for that?
European languages. I'm speaking several others. I live there. I love the place. Why should we turn away Asia?
I guess we've got one. Well, we've got a couple of authentic Europeans here. So, Frank, let's go to the unambiguous non-European.
One of my jobs, in addition to the arms control piece, is handling our extended deterrence requirements with our friends and allies around the world. And at one time, I was talking to one of the real U.S. experts on this issue, and I said, we need to be focused 100% on Asia. And he said, Frank, you can't think about extended deterrence from a purely regional perspective. You've got to think of it from a global perspective, because what happens in one of the key 3 strategic regions in the United States, Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, has effects on extended deterrence in other parts of the world. For example, I spend a lot of my time in Asia, and during the beginning of the Ukraine crisis, I got a lot of questions from our Asian allies saying, Frank, how does what happens in Europe affect our security? So you can't look at these issues in isolation. You have to have a global view. And if we are perceived as not being a European power, allowing chaos in Europe, that may embolden other potential adversaries. So you have to have I would say, a holistic view, and we cannot just be focused on one region. We have to be able to chew gum and walk at the same time.
I'm going to go one in the back corner, and then we'll come up to here. So if you could, yes, ma'am, all the way in the back.
Hi, my name is Hasmik. I'm from the World Affairs Council of Orange County. I have 2 questions, actually, one for Mr. Czolij and the other one for Ambassador Simonyi. So my first question is, do you feel that Crimea's supposed, the 90% or plus Russian population was a justification for Russia's annexation of Crimea? And when can it ever be a justification in any case? And for Ambassador Simonyi, how do you feel about Hungary's reaction towards the Syrian refugee crisis? How do you feel about Hungary's reaction towards the Syrian refugee crisis?
Good question, but since we got 2 of them, let's get our answers in half.
Well, first of all, regarding Crimea, it's not 90%, and this, I think that the Russian minority, the Ukrainian minority and the Tatars and the Russians that are living in Crimea are seeing and will see as time evolves that they're living in an area where human rights are violated. They are violated for everybody, and I think that if there was a referendum, a democratic referendum done even today in Crimea, I think that Crimea would revert back to Ukraine.
Thank you for your question. I totally disagree with Mr. Orban's handling of the refugee crisis. I don't think building walls, and I don't believe individual European countries should find a solution or try and find a solution on their own. I believe that we have to hang together and give a common European response. Otherwise, I think we're just coming to the wrong conclusion. I truly believe in multiculturalism. There is no such thing as a Hungarian. Every Hungarian is Turkish, Jewish, German, Romanian, Ukrainian, a little Hungarian. But I'd like to say that this is the wrong answer, and I want to strongly support what Ambassador Sullivan said, that we are going to get through this. And I'm telling you, a few months, maybe a few years from now, Mr. Orban will look really silly when Europe has gotten through this, and he is underestimating the resilience of the European countries.
Yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to add one thing so that I would not be misunderstood. When I said revert back to Ukraine, I obviously meant revert back de facto, because the international community has not recognized rightfully the illegal annexation of Crimea.
Thank you, John. Thank you for moderating this. One observation, because there's been a lot of talk about Putin right now. I've had the pleasure of professionally covering the fall of communism, the Balkans, as well as human trafficking and terrorism for 15 years. And I'm wondering why you all think that Putin may be more of a danger to the West's security and European security, and this is addressed to you, Ambassador O'Sullivan. then non-state actors who can obtain yellow cake that was found in Libya during the Arab Rising, as well as the uncollected 20,000 man pads, even though the State Department has said that they have collected 5,000, but those operations on the ground have said that it's been 0.
Well, I don't think I did say. I think I said precisely. I listed non-state actors as amongst the security threats that we're facing. So I think I did try to categorize the diversity of threats to our security, of which this is one. And I think I even said, by the way, that it's very difficult to prioritize one over the other and say this is absolutely more important than that, because frankly, as Frank just said, we have to walk and chew gum. We have to address all of these issues simultaneously. And this is a huge challenge, but I essentially agree. That doesn't mean that I don't think that Mr. Putin is a major challenge, and I do think that the tearing up of the rule book of European security architecture built by Helsinki and what happened after the wall, and I mean the Budapest Agreement, for example, when Ukraine gave up their nuclear weapons against a guarantee of territorial integrity, what lesson is that for countries of the world? So I do think Mr. Putin does represent a particularly sharp and dramatic threat, but it is, we have to manage a lot of other threats simultaneously, and they will all have to be addressed. And by the way, I would suggest, going back to the previous question, that for the United States, I understand the United States has a stake in Asia. We have a massive stake in Asia. We're the largest trading partner of most Asian countries, more so than the United States. We are the single largest destination of exports for most Asian countries after China, and we're China's largest export market. So we have a major stake in the peace and prosperity of Asia, but together, as Frank said, you can't dissociate. What happens in Asia has an influence on what happens in Europe. Mr. Putin stretches from Europe right through to Asia. And we have to connect these dots, and the only way in which this will ever work, as we know, as always, will be transatlantic unity and transatlantic unity of purpose in addressing this multiplicity of threats.
If this were the Oscars, the orchestra would be starting to play. I don't know, Bill Clifford, do we have time for one or two more? One more. Okay. Yes, ma'am. Thank you. You're going to get the last word, at least for now, not for the week.
Well, this isn't about Russia. I have a question about Turkey. I have two questions about Turkey. Should Turkey have been brought into the EU? And is Turkey now, with the concentration of power of Erdogan, a reliable NATO partner?
Good question. Then who would you most like to hear that? Ambassador Czolij. Yes. Okay.
Yeah, well, on the first point, I mean, Turkey is a candidate to join the European Union, and those negotiations are ongoing. You should not underestimate the challenge. Joining the European Union is not like joining a chess club or joining the World Affairs Council. The nearest analogy I could give you would be that you were suggesting that Mexico would become the 51st state of the Union. It is a binding together of your destiny. Turkey would have more members of the European Parliament than any other member state. So legislation, voting on human rights, on data privacy, on food safety, I mean, this is a massive move. And so it's not surprising that it's going to take a bit of time to decide how and under what circumstances that's going to happen. And that's where we are. Of course, you have the complexity of Turkey's continued illegal occupation of northern Cyprus. By the way, going back to talking about illegal occupations, that's still an unresolved issue. It is looking more optimistic. And we have the domestic developments in Turkey, which, of course, all countries joining the European Union have to meet our requirements in terms of fundamental rights, respect for democracy, human rights, and Turkey is, the behavior of Turkey is certainly complicating that. So this is going to be a complicated discussion. I hope that we will ultimately find a solution. If not, there maybe will have to be some kind of special relationship, but that's where we are. In terms of the NATO, perhaps Andras wants to say a word, and I'll let him talk about that.
Yeah, I just want to be on the safe side. Turks gave Hungary the running water, so that's the way I look at Turkey. It's true. I'd like to, I do think we missed an opportunity earlier to bring Turkey closer. I'm not a fan of Mr. Erdogan. I think Turkey is sliding in the wrong direction, and I think basically he too is professing the illiberal democracy that Mr. Orban and Mr. Putin loves. But let me, as a final word, may I say that I just want to be very, very clear. I don't think any of us, and in particular the Europeans, see an alternative to a strong transatlantic relationship, and that should be the bottom line.
We're down from the floor. Are you guys, unless there's a last word? Hey, these guys really delivered. Thank you very much.
Pleasure to meet you.